Systemic Racism and Inequality, a Jedi training presented by the Mid-Hudson Library System. These self-paced trainings are meant to help library staff members discover more about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, not only in the workplace, but the world at large. The questions asked throughout these trainings are meant for private reflection. First, let us watch this video about systemic racism.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
For our purposes, we will define systemic racism as racism and/or inequality that is carried out and sustained by laws, rules, policies, and institutions. Systemic racism can also be called institutional racism. Let us dig deeper into policies and look at the statistics that illustrate systemic racism in our society. According to one study from the American Prospect, white families hold 90% of the national wealth, Latino families hold 2.3%, and Black families hold 2.6%. This disparity is caused in part by systemic racism. For example, the Great Recession hit minority families particularly hard because of predatory lending practices, causing the wealth gap to increase even more. The Black unemployment rate has been consistently twice that of whites over the past 60 years. You may point to educational gaps as an explanation, but according to a 2013 study from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Black people with college degrees are twice as likely to be unemployed as all other graduates. Additionally, a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that applicants with white-sounding names get called back for interviews about 50% more of the time than applicants with Black-sounding names, even when they have identical resumes. Black students represent 16% of the student population, but 32 to 42% of students suspended or expelled. In comparison, white students make up 51% of the student population, but represent a similar range of 31 to 40% of students suspended or expelled. A much higher proportion of Black students are expelled. This is due in large part to issues stemming from systemic racism. For example, many schools have policies that do not allow for dreadlocks, braids, cornrows, and afros. These styles are very much a part of Black culture, and rules against them result in more punishments for Black students than white students. These bad policies are demanding that Black students use chemical hair straighteners and spend more time on fixing their hair, even though it has nothing to do with their education. The thing to remember is that systemic racism is our collective fault as a society. By being aware of power dynamics and our own implicit biases, we can understand how policies affect each other and move toward a more just society. Here are some things to think about. 1. Self-reflection is painful and necessary. Take an implicit bias test and learn more about your own preconceptions. Think about the world around you. Are there inequities that exist that you didn't realize were a result of systemic racism? 2. Think about things you can advocate for as an individual. Internet access is a universal right that in today's society is crucial to obtaining a good education and a job. As library workers, we can advocate for universal broadband rights. 3. Sometimes things need to change. Policy that may have seemed appropriate when it was created might need to be changed or eliminated because of unforeseen consequences or the ability to apply it inconsistently, which could result in inequality. Most of us are not policy makers, but we can call out bad policy when we see it, and we can also try to ensure that we do not let our own implicit bias get in the way of how we apply policy. Finally, we want to address the use of the term systemic racism. Many thought leaders in the anti-racist and social justice fields do not like to use the term, stating that systemic racism as a term is redundant because systemic racism is just racism. We chose to talk about systemic racism because the term is one you might hear in discussions of race in America and is an interesting way to examine a particular set of problems involving laws, institutions, and policies. It allows us to explore specific issues of racism beyond our typical day-to-day actions, which we can address both individually and collectively through advocacy, policy, and how we implement those policies. Resources: The American Prospects Wealth Study, Democracy Now!, Median wealth. Reuters article, Predatory Lending and Race. The Atlantic. African Americans with college degrees are twice as likely to be unemployed as other graduates. Civil rights data collection. Data snapshot. School discipline.